Good morning, everyone. Good morning. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet, I'm Chaplain Lisa Ishihara, and I have the opportunity to serve here as a university chaplain at Seattle Pacific University. This morning, I get to welcome you to our 80th year remembrance of the Japanese incarceration. We've entitled this morning, Honoring Wisdom. This morning, we'll take some time to reflect as an institution on the journey of incarceration of the Japanese Americans and how that experience has impacted our future and shaped our current generations today. Today's chapel is a remembrance and a response to our history and to our story in the United States of America. This past Saturday was February 19th. It was my birthday. And so it is always a mixed day for me, because February 19th is also the day of remembrance when the US government issued Executive Order 9066 under President Franklin Roosevelt, leading to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, even though they were US citizens. This part of history is also part of my own familial history. My grandfather and my grandmother on my mother's side were incarcerated at Roher, Arkansas, and my great-grandfather on my dad's side was sent to Minidoka, Idaho. My grandfather and my grandmother on my father's side were also in camp. They were first sent to Manzanar, and then my grandfather was sent to Tule Lake. All of my grandparents were born here and were American citizens. This is very real for my family, and it's close to my own heart. And in all transparency, this story is actually very frequently on the forefront of my mind. It shaped my life. It shaped the access that my family had. They lost their belongings. It changed our socioeconomic status. And my parents passed this down to me, that you not just represent yourself and your immediate family, but you actually represent all Japanese Americans, and that we're working to prove that we are good, loyal people. And I still wrestle with this part of my family's journey. I'm thankful for members and leaders of our Japanese American congregations here in the Seattle area who have been meeting with us in university ministries to plan and prepare for this time of worship together. This morning, we will get to hear from the Onishi family from Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church. Mr. Kenji Onishi lived and was in the incarceration camps. And you have no idea what a treasure and a gift it is to be able to hear firsthand, getting a real glimpse through his life, through his eyes. We're so blessed to have the Onishi family here, so I just want to take a moment and ask you to stand so that we can welcome you into our community and also welcome back Lynn, who is an SPU alum. Thank you for being here with us this morning. I'm so grateful to Reverend Karen Yokota Love and the Onishi family from Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church for joining us today. May we see the ways that God has worked in their lives. And may God help us to not forget the past so that we might grow together in wisdom. As we begin our time, Susan Okamoto Lane and Reverend Deacon Paulie Shigaki will remind us of our history.
Good morning. I'm Paulie Shigaki, and I'm going to take this mask off, but Saturday we were part of an event at Puyallup Fairgrounds, and both of these buttons have my parents, who were single when they entered Minidoka. Their prison numbers are on these, and so it could be my earrings today. Anyway, thank you very much. So I am a vocational deacon at St. Peter's Episcopal Parish, which is in the central area, and I came to the diaconate at age 68, so I'm still working on that, so it's never too late for anyone to do things. Because of Lisa's wonderful introduction, the printed thing of what I was going to say is in your bulletin, so you can read that, and I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of this synopsis of the history of Executive Order 9066. For decades prior to Imperial Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor on Sunday, December 7th, anti-Japanese sentiment had been building on the West Coast. Increasing immigration aroused the fears of white jobs that were threatened by cheap labor force, and the agitating and escalating racist rhetoric of yellow peril and the Japanese invasion problem allowed the implementation of many restrictive laws, exclusion acts, and very active exclusion leagues. And I would ask you to research into the Bellevue, the history of Bellevue, actually. And despite the Munson report, intelligence report that was commissioned by President Roosevelt that concluded that the majority of Japanese Americans were loyal to the United States and would not pose a threat to national security in the event of war, a declaration of war against Japan was brought by the President and passed by Congress on December 8, 1941. Anti-Japanese sentiment, hysteria, and pressure on the government to remove people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, where over 2/3 were American citizens, led Congress to act and President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 9066, 80 years ago on February 19, 1942. So that authorized military authorities to exclude civilians from any area without due process. And while the order does not specify Japanese Americans specifically, they were the only group to have been imprisoned as a result of Executive Order 9066. So in March 1942, the process began to forcibly remove all persons of Japanese and Japanese American ancestry living in the western halves of Washington, Oregon, all of California, and parts of Arizona, into 15 assembly centers, one of which was at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, where most of the Seattle folks went, until the 10 permanent camps were completed. On March 24th of 1942, the Army issued the first civilian exclusion order for Bainbridge Island near Seattle, where 45 families were given 1 week to prepare. By the end of October of 42, there were 108 exclusion orders issued. In May of 42, incarcerees began to transfer into these 10 permanent warlord relocation incarceration facilities, which we euphemistically call camps, in these desolated, isolated areas: Manzanar, California, Poston and Gila River, Arizona, Topaz, Utah, Grenada, Colorado, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Minidoka, Idaho, Tule Lake, California, and Jerome and Roar in Arkansas. The historical causes were later proven not justified by military necessity, but driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. The effects of Executive Order 9066, the forced removal and mass incarceration of nearly 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, has constituted the defining event in our history. 80 years later, it continues to impact our community with oppression and intergenerational trauma that is still being silently and unconsciously transmitted to our younger generations.
My name is Susan Okamoto Lane, and I worked at Seattle Pacific University for 36 years, retired at the end of June 2019. I'm a Seattle native. I grew up going to Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church. I'm a member now at Lake Burien Presbyterian. My mother was at Minidoka. My father's family was at Tule Lake and then at Heart Mountain in Wyoming. You'll hear a lot of generational names as we're going through our program today, and it's also in your printed program. They are very significant in Japanese American history. So Issei is first-generation Japanese immigrants who migrated prior to the dictates of the Immigration Act of 1924, which stopped Japanese immigration into the U.S., the bulk arriving after 1885. And they were working on railroads and, they were laborers. The vast majority of Issei were thus middle-aged or older during World War II. Nisei, second-generation American-born and thus U.S. citizens. The bulk of Nisei were teens, children, teens, or young adults during World War II. Sansei, or Kibei Nisei, or Kibei, those who were born in the U.S. but mostly raised or educated in Japan. Sansei, third generation, grandchildren of Issei, children of Nisei. The vast majority of Sansei, like me, were born after World War II. Generational range parallels baby boomers. And because of the World War II experience of Japanese Americans, we were raised to be all American. Fourth generation Yonsei, fifth generation Gosei, sixth generation Rokusei. So you could refer to that in your program as you hear these terms. I have the honor of introducing Reverend Karen Yokota Love, who will be moderating the conversation after this. She, her, hers. She currently serves as senior pastor at Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church in Seattle, which is in the North Beacon Hill neighborhood. She is a Yonsei, or fourth generation Japanese American. Most of her family members were all incarcerated at Tule Lake, California after receiving Executive Order 9066. Reverend Karen has spent her life collecting stories about her ancestors' experiences during their detention to help bring light to justice and healing. She also enjoys educating people about the negative history and how we use the past to work towards a better future. Reverend Karen is the first woman to serve as senior pastor at Blaine Memorial. Reverend Karen currently serves as the chair of the National Japanese American United Methodist Caucus and is a member of the Board of Ordained Ministry with the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference in the United Methodist Church. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master's of Divinity degree from Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California. When not at church, Karen enjoys spending time with her husband, Jesse, exploring different areas of the Pacific Northwest, hiking, taking long walks, reading, and attending a good yoga class. Karen, Reverend Karen.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here today, to be able to moderate this conversation. And I am just pleased to introduce the Kenji Onishi family, and they are also here supporting and watching. This is Kenji Onishi, and he has been a Blaine Memorial member since 1952. That's quite a bit of time. And his late wife, Martha, I'm told, was in the Blaine Memorial Choir for 50 years. So that kind of gives you an idea of how long they've been members. And then there's Eugene Onishi, who is our Sansei, or third generation today. And he is an active member with his wife, Kathy Onishi, at Blaine. And he serves as our director of choir or music. So he puts together all of the pieces that we get to sing every Sunday. And during this time of the pandemic, he has become the most excellent music mixer. So he mixes music now. And so thank you, Eugene, for being here. And then this is Eugene's daughter, Lynn Onishi, and she serves actually at our church as a co-youth director. She has been a member since she was born. She's also our fourth generation, or Yonsei, representative today. So we have the entire Onishi family, multi-generation, and we're going to have a multi-generational conversation of the effects of the last 80 years since Executive Order 9066 was issued. And so let us begin our conversation. So Kenji, I would like to invite you to tell the audience who you are and where you come from, and just a little bit about your family so they can get to know you.
I was born in Portland, Oregon, 1927. My father, a Japanese immigrant, came in 1898 at age 21 as a railroad laborer, but he had a career as a foreman of the track laborers. Most of my boyhood life was raised and ran around in the Portland Railroad yard. In 1940, Father retired from the railroad and bought a hotel business in downtown Portland. He spent all of his retirement money to go into business. So when we were forced from Portland, we were moved from downtown Portland to the Assembly Center in Portland.
Thank you. And do you remember, it sounds like you had a very successful business. Do you remember what it was like for your family, your parents, when they received Executive Order 9066?
Well, one of the first things that happened was when we received or saw the notices on the street, Father and another Issei were discussing what they, as Japanese, should do. Father took the side of the JCL to go along with the U.S. government, do what they tell you to do. Don't raise a great big fuss about it or fight in the street about it. And in a heated moment of the argument, had a heart attack and died on that day.
I'm so sorry that you lost your father right before you're about to leave your home. So how did that impact your mother?
Mother was an Issei woman, like most Issei women, had very little English skills or work skills, and she was worried sick about how to take care of the kids. How am I going to feed these kids? What am I going to do for a living? And she was on the verge of being sick herself.
And yet you still evacuated, and you eventually made your way to Minidoka, one of the incarceration camps. Kenji, what was it like when you arrived at Minidoka, and can you describe your living conditions?
Arriving at Minidoka is almost like looking out the window and saying, there are no trees, no bushes, no blue water. It was a totally different environment. Hundreds, thousands of acres of sagebrush, nothing taller than 10 feet high, nothing green. It was a totally foreign landscape to us from the Northwest.
So it was dry, it was desert, it was dusty, and like you said, it was a foreign new land. Can you describe the kind of, where did you sleep?
Where did we sleep?
Sleep, yeah. Where did you sleep?
Well, each family was given one room. For us 6, it was a room 20 feet by 20 feet or so. One room. I can't think of anything else to add to that because there wasn't anything added to the room.
So it's a small room. You had a large family, and did you have privacy?
Well, we had a family of 6 My oldest sister was 19, 17, 15. I was 30. Well, I got it wrong now. I'm 2 years behind time. My oldest sister was 21, 21, 19, 17. I was 15, and my brother was 13. We weren't little children, and for us, the boys adapted pretty well to lack of privacy. We could stand in the middle of the room and undress ourselves and get into our pajamas. The girls to stand in the middle of the living room, undress and get into their sleeping clothes was a little bit different. And going to the communal toilet room, too, for boys, going to the bathroom, taking a shower in front of strangers and whatnot was no big deal. But for the girls, it wasn't quite the same. Eventually, my sister put up a large curtain around their side of the bedroom and made their own privacy. But privacy was one of the big issues of the time.
So you had no privacy, and you did go to a mess hall to eat every day, and your meals, I'm told, were at specific times. What did that do to your family dynamics when were you able to eat together at the same time as a family?
I don't remember any meals with my mother.
So did you end up spending more time with friends in camp, just eating with your friends?
The boys hung around with each other from 7:30 in the morning till 9:30 at night, eating all the meals together. There was no such thing as a family meal.
So the camp life actually, it almost destroyed family meal time, a traditional time that you would have, to catch up on what you did during your day and what happened. Can you tell me a little bit more about, okay, so you're in a desert, you're living in a very small space, a very small barrack, there's no privacy. It sounds like your dignity is almost taken away. How did you make the best of this experience?
One of the funny things about the whole camp experience, if you listen to most Nisei's at the time, I don't know of anyone who didn't go to camp angry. We were angry because our government said, "You're not an American," which was like being walking down the street and being labeled or slurred every time you walk down the street.
That's okay. Yeah, that's.
But other than that, we got acclimated to the environment, got over our anger somehow, and continued with life as we knew it. Those of us boys who played sports most of our young lives went back to the baseball field and played and learned to be pretty good players because we spent so much time honing our skills. And the singers, people who sang, had a chance to practice and perform, and they became quite proficient in their singing and whatnot. My wife Martha's mother, my wife Martha, was 8 years old, but before that time, spent much of her growing up years singing and performing for the police officers whose precinct was next door. And she continued to sing, and that became one of her things.
That's beautiful. So Martha would sing to the police officers because their precinct was next door. And later you'll get to experience the Onishi family singing. What Martha has passed down is beautiful. So Kenji, thank you for sharing those aspects of your life. And it sounds like you made the best of a bad situation.
I think when people are put into these kinds of situations, whether they're imprisoned or you hear about veterans talking about being prisoners of war or any tough situation, it does make people stronger to stand together and say, we're in it together, we'll get out of this together.
Thank you, Kenji. So, Eugene, I have a question for you. Kenji has a good outlook on life, and I'm wondering how, with his and Martha's influence in raising you and your siblings, how you've been able to, kind of embody those good moral and values and those characteristics, and how this executive order essentially affected your generation.
Well, it was interesting earlier, and I'm sorry, I don't remember if it was Susan or Paulie who mentioned that they grew up with their parents emphasizing to be American because of the experience of being in camp. So when we were growing up, my parents never talked about camp, but a lot of the things that my dad has told us over time now, really after we were adults, we learned more and more about the experience and more about how the experience of camp influenced their lives. So as Reverend Karen said, my parents, they met at Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church. And my dad's been a member now for, I guess it's 70 years. And my mom was a member actually for longer, I think, from the time she was a young teen until she passed away this past fall. So we grew up in a family that was full of faith, that was full of love. And another thing that my dad picked up, said he really matured in camp was being in that space. And he said, everybody banded together, everybody grew together, everybody became stronger together. His ability to communicate with everybody, to talk with everybody, to respect everybody, to listen to everybody, I think really was something that he worked to pass on to all of us, both in what he said and just the way that my parents acted and that we picked up from them. And then, another thing is, my dad has always been extremely positive about everything. And I think that also comes, somewhat from camp. I think somewhat from the way he was raised in general and the way his parents brought him up, but also the experience in camp in just learning to make the best of a bad situation. I think that positivity is something that got passed on to our generation as well. My dad didn't mention this, but one of the sports that he picked up when he was in camp actually was golfing. So there's a man in camp who went out in the sagebrush. He was a golfer, and his friends shipped him his golf clubs, and he went out in the desert in the sagebrush and made some holes out there just in the sand and clearing sagebrush out. And my dad golfed from the time he was 17 years old until he suffered a stroke in December. But he played golf in October. So he golfed until he was 94 years old. So that's another thing that he picked up from the experience of camp that you wouldn't expect, that carried him through most of his life.
Thank you, Eugene. And Lynn, I'm curious. Okay, we said 80 years ago, the executive order was issued. As a fourth generation Japanese American, how has this affected you?
Many ways. I think for much of my life, I felt pretty distant from this experience, right? Because this is, my grandparents were children, teenagers when this happened. I did learn as a child. I remember going to my grandparents' house and my grandpa kind of doing this presentation for me and my cousins at the time. And so I had some knowledge of the incarceration experience and what happened, but I didn't really think that this was something that affected me and my life because this is 80 years ago, right? And I grew up in a very privileged kind of situation. I grew up in a wealthy white suburb, and I had a lot of the opportunities that you look at as like the American dream, and I'm really grateful for the opportunities that I have had because of my parents and because of my grandparents and the ways that they were able to stay positive, to provide for their families. But I always felt like there was just like something off. Like I grew up, with all these ideal things, and it felt like there was something missing, or I felt like I wasn't quite sure where I fit in, or this kind of like lack of identity. I guess that's probably how I'd put it, like a lack of identity. I, again, grew up in a pretty white community. I didn't have friends of color growing up, really. And I faced a lot of the, the microaggression kinds of things you get when you're an Asian person in America. But eventually, I went to high school, and there were more Asian people at my high school, which is really cool for me. But they also, made a lot of comments that I wasn't really Asian. I was called like a Twinkie or a banana, like you're yellow on the outside, but really you're white on the inside. And there are a lot of jokes that went around. And it bothered me, but I didn't really have anything to say back to that. I was like, I think they're right. Maybe I am white on the inside, and I don't know anything about, my Japanese culture. I know nothing. And I don't speak the language, and I've never been to Japan, and I feel like I just lacked an Asian American identity. But the one place that I did feel I could kind of just be myself and I didn't have to think about that was actually at church. It was my faith community. I grew up in the church that my dad was raised in. And so, once a week I would get to see my friends from church for an hour, and a lot of them are also Japanese American, Asian American teens at the time, and it was something that I could go in that space, and I didn't have to explain myself, and I didn't feel this pressure to have to be like the model citizen. I know Chaplain Lisa had mentioned, you're kind of a representative for all Japanese Americans, and I definitely felt that in other places in my life, but with my church community, I didn't have to deal with that. And I think that's really what got me through most of high school, was having that community there. Where I could just be.
That's great. So it's kind of like you're neither here nor there. You're living in a liminal space. You feel white, but you're really Asian. But then you're trying to figure out that identity piece, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I felt like, I didn't get language passed down to me. There are a lot of cultural things I didn't really understand, but the values. I feel like my life has been shaped by a lot of Japanese values in ways that I did not realize until I was in college, and I had a friend that I made at SPU who was from Japan, and I would say things about, I think in this way, or, my parents told me this, and they were like, wow, that's like really Japanese. And I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense. But, the other things that I didn't get to experience because of this sort of like forced assimilation of Japanese Americans into, like you have to be a model citizen, you have to be as American as possible in order to survive. There's a lot of culture that I feel like I missed out on because of that. And I don't blame my parents or my grandparents, but it was just something you had to do to survive. And so I think there was something missing.
Right. And, Lynn, like I said earlier, is a co-director of our youth group at Lane. And she just finished actually teaching 2 lessons on the Day of Remembrance, on the Executive Order 9066. And so this question is for actually all 3 of you. As you continue to live and you live out the legacy of Kenji and Martha, I'm wondering how you take this piece of history and you bring it to the present moment and you relate it to right now, because there's a lot of stuff in our media or in our life and politics that's going on right now that could be easily relatable to 80 years ago. So Kenji, what do you want to tell our audience today? What do you want to say to them from your heart?
The thing that made me the most angry back in 1942 was to be told or be perceived as not American. I lived my whole boyhood life being an American, and that business of you're not an American really made me more angry than losing my father. And I vowed then that when I'm old enough to fight for the United States Army, I would put the uniform on and they would see me fighting for the U.S. and not the great lie that I would turn my back on my own country. America is made up of many, many different colored people. It is not a matter of skin color. America is of the heart. We are Americans, and I would hope that everyone understands that. Now, there is a movement in these times of even discussing issues like this. There are people who say, don't listen to all this old history business. It only hurts our feelings. We need to know history. We need to remember what wrongs we have committed as a country. So it is a real live issue and should be kept alive. Things like the incarceration and the Holocaust should not be forgotten. Things like chasing the Chinese out of Tacoma and other cities in the West for Filipinos, and all the things we have done to people of color should not be forgotten. Doesn't mean that you have to feel guilty about it, but don't let it happen again. And know that skin color is not America. Skin color or America is what we in our hearts feel.
Thank you, Kenji. Eugene, do you want to add to what your father just said?
I think what he said is so important. I can't emphasize enough that we really need to make sure that we don't repeat the sins of the past. I think in a sense, the flip side of that is, I think the positivity that my dad has lived his whole life living is something that is so important also to all of us. And I would just, encourage everyone to try to look on the positive side, to try to see the good in yourself and see the good in other people, and to keep looking for the good, and living to bring good into the world.
And Lynn, can you explain or share with us what you would like to tell the audience from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that have been mentioned already, as far as actually looking at our history, I know that people talk about like critical race theory not being taught in schools. People need to know what happened and the atrocities that our government, our country has committed against its own citizens from the beginning of this thing we call America, right? And so I would just encourage, if you all are educators, to continue teaching about our past so that we don't repeat what has already happened. I would say I'm now at a place where I'm starting to reckon with my family's own history, and really thinking about what happened, what wrongs were committed, what has my Japanese American lost out on because of what happened in 1942. And in a lot of ways, I think I'm just kind of beginning that journey. But I think my faith really comes into play here too, because I think about this idea of like righteous anger, and that's something that I'm allowed to feel. Like I'm allowed to be angry where there is injustice and where there is wrongdoing against people. And I think Jesus displays that for us. And I would like to. I would like to do all I can to be able to feel that, and to be able to act on that righteous anger, to make things better, to correct, to bring justice where there is injustice, right? And I think there are multiple ways you can go about doing that. But I think participating, using the privileges that you do have. So for me, like I can vote in every election. That's something that's very important to me. I have the right to vote, and to protect the right to vote. For all of us. I think about there are so many people in our society today who are oppressed, who are experiencing injustice in ways that are just, I mean, it's so large. Like the problems, the injustices are so big, they're systemic, right? And so as one person, it feels intimidating because it's like, how much can I really do? But using what I can do, listening to other people who don't usually have the microphone, right? And showing up where I can show up, signing petitions, contacting my legislators, right? There are ways that I can show up and to play my part in bringing about justice for all people.
Thank you. I think this concludes our conversation. It's obvious that God is working through each and every one of you, through your tenacity, through your hope, and through your drive to just never forget and to continue to tell the story. So thank you. And at this time,
with us this morning. As we continue to move through our time of worship, I think that these are great transformative moments to actually pause and to ask God, what are you asking me to see? What are you doing in my life? In what ways have you moved before, and in what ways might you move me today? And so let's just take the next few moments just in silence to ponder that with God. And for maybe some of us, it's just a moment of reflection. But I also believe that God is working in this space. And then we'll be going into a song. And I just invite you to take that moment to offer yourselves to God and to one another in worship. So just take the next maybe like 5 seconds in silent prayer, and then the song will play. So we might be hitting a little hiccup with the song. So I'm going to invite us to continue in this moment of prayer. God, I believe in communal worship. I believe in the opportunity that we have as collectivistic communities to worship you in different ways, God. I believe that you are doing a work in this place. And God, I thank you that we can take a moment to remember that our stories matter, that we were created in the image of God, created to reflect the beauty and the goodness of you, and that we get to enjoy and delight in that together, but also be present in the things that are hard and challenging, and know that we are not alone. And God, there are always uncomfortable things that kind of come up when we talk about really hard things. And yet in the midst of that, you are present with us, and we have the gift of being present with one another. So God, help us to hold these fond memories at moments when people got to connect in incarceration camps, but also help us to hold the memories of pain and injustice. And to know that you are present with us no matter what we carry. God, I'm grateful for all of those that have come before us, who have laid a foundation for us to grow more and more into the people of you that you have made us to be. God, I pray for your continued work in our lives in that. And God, we thank you for this moment that we get to honor those who have come before us. We have this moment to honor and respect and be in community with those who lived through the incarceration camps. And so if you have someone near you, I invite you to extend a hand towards that person. And if you are online, we will be extending our hands to you online as well. But we praise God for each one of you who lived and grew and became more and more who God created you to be. And we give thanks for what you have endured. We give thanks for the perseverance and the character that was grown and developed in each one of you so that we could become the people that you have made us to be. And so in this moment, we honor you. God honors you. God sees you as beautiful and perfect. May you receive and know the deep love of God. May you be honored in this space where we get to be in community together. We give thanks for your life, for each one of your lives. And God, we praise you and give you the glory for being present with us and loving us in these spaces. God, I pray for the redemptive work of your Holy Spirit to be working in and through each one of us in our communities of faith, God, but here also at SPU. That you would give us eyes to see as you see, that you would give us a movement in our hearts towards you and the things that you have called us to do, God. That we would see injustice, that we would move towards mercy, that we would move toward your righteousness, God. And that we would also feel and experience the places that you feel and experience righteous anger. And that in those places, you would do your good work in us and through us. And that, God, your Spirit would be the one that binds us together in community. So, God, I thank you so much that, we can be here in this space together and be reminded that we're not alone. I don't think it's a mistake that each one of us is in this room or online. We get to look back and remember our history. We get to also continue to move through and honor those that have paid a price for us, for our freedoms, for the ways that you have worked and moved in and through us. And God, we also look to the future, knowing and trusting that you are good and faithful, and you will continue to be good and faithful. So God, do your good work in us. Help us to offer ourselves to you and to one another. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us for this time. We're so grateful for our community here at SPU that we can worship together in this space. May you be blessed as you go from here today. See you next time.